Good evening, everybody. I guess it was a long day, so uh, it was a very good introduction given by Gavathan about the limitations and the advantages of CD. So I'll start my talk with the topic of my talk is higher order structure, characterization of biologics using secular records. So before I begin, I just would like to acknowledge my alma mater and my current organization for all the learnings that I've had so far. So, to begin with the outline of my talk today, so I'll just briefly touch upon HOS because I guess over the whole day you've heard a lot about HOS. I'll just then go to how CD is used for biologic assessment. Then I'll talk about how you would be using far UV and near UV CD and how the methods are developed and qualified, and then briefly touch upon some case studies. Then my last part of my talk will focus on secondary structure estimation. So this, I'll skip these slides because already you've heard mostly about HOS and all those things and how, so this slide is pretty much, you've seen it throughout the day, but what I want to focus is that all the traditional tools of higher order structure which are at the base of this pyramid are because they are easy to use. As you go up the pyramid, they are information rich, however labor intensive. So similarly, I guess this is also, you have seen this. So CD lies somewhere in the middle. It's a really established method which can provide you global information. So some of these slides are overlapping. Same thing. So far UV CD, near UV CD, they are low resolution methods, but they can, the ease of use of these methods is really high. So then this also, I think Navratna has talked about this. So I'll directly jump into. So in this room, I just want to ask you, how many people have actually looked at a CD instrument? Quite a few, I guess. So to people who have actually not had a chance to look at a CD instrument, so this is how a CD instrument looks. So this is a JASCO, so there are multiple vendors like JASCO, AVIV, and so on. So this is how the CD instrument looks. So you have also a temperature Peltier device which you can connect to. This is the switch, which is a water bar. So what we usually use this is for thermal melting studies. You have a Peltier device where you can actually change the temperature so that your protein unfolds and measure the electricity using thermal melt. So this is a complementary, this is an accessory which comes with the CD instrument, which you can always buy and use it. So this is the software that goes in using the instrument. It's called a Spectra Manager, and nowadays with all the biologics regulatory authorities, they recommend a 21 CFR compliant software. So Spectra Manager, which comes with the JASCO instrument, is a 21 CFR compliant software. So the actual parameters when you open the software looks like this. So I'll touch upon each of these parameters one by one in my next slide. But if you look at the parameter settings, so you have two channels, one which actually measures the CD signal, other one channel 2. It's called as HT. So HT stands for high tension. So it is a voltage. So this is a very important factor when you actually collect your data. Then you can specify the start and the end wavelengths, which is where you put in. Then you have data pitch. Here is 0.2 nanometers. So what it means is that data for your whole spectrum is collected every 0.2 nanometers. So you'll have data points like from 260 to 205 means 258.8, 258.6, and so on. So then you have start mode, immediately you start collecting data, scanning mode, which means data is collected continuously, so you select. So these are like drop-down menus which you can select in your software. Then you have the scanning speed, the speed at which data is collected. You can specify it there. So then you have other parameters which I'll go through during my talk. So sensitivity, DIT, which is data integration time. Then you have bandwidth. So that again defines the quality of your data. The number of accumulations. The number of accumulations defines your signal to noise ratio. So going forward, so these were the parameters that I was talking about, the scanning mode that you set. So you have two modes, which is continuous mode and step mode. So continuous mode, it obtains data online when your scan is going on, so which provides a higher signal to noise ratio. So typically in our biologics measurement, you always go for continuous mode. Then you have your response or data integration time. It defines the time which is taken to accumulate the photometric value in your photometric spectrum data collection. Then you have your scan speed. So this again determines the time it spends at a particular wavelength before it moves on to the next wavelength. So typically for biologics measurement, we go anywhere from 50 nanometer per minute to 20 nanometer per minute, but it again depends on how much time you want to spend collecting data. So the normal range is 20 to 50 nanometer per minute. So then you have bandwidth. So bandwidth is again defined as the wavelength resolution of the measuring light at half width. So this is like is again determined by this useful equation where your scan speed multiplied by your data integration time should always be lesser than your bandwidth. So this is a typical recommended formula which we use when we define our instrument collecting parameters. So then you also have a number of accumulations. So the more number of accumulations, the signal to noise ratio is much better. So similarly, data pitch is the number of data points that are taken during the scan. So going on to far UV CD method development. So this is one important point which I think even Aditya got it forward. Do you want to collect data on your drug substance or your drug product? So the data that I'm showing on the left is actually the drug substance. So the only difference between the drug substance and drug product is that you add your, the final formulation, excipient. So what you typically see in this right-hand profile, so I have just added one component here, metacresol, which is a part of my drug product. And you can see the spectra has so much interference. So typically for something, so I have put here matrix interference of metacresol observed in drug product buffer. So what it means is that my drug product is not actually very ideal for me to collect data. So what do? So like Aditya said, so you have to extract your component or your drug substance from the drug product and then show that this extraction does not affect the final efficacy or the potency of the molecule. So what we have observed typically whenever we submit data for drugs for CD data, so they want comparison between our drug product and also with our drug substance. So what we do is extract the drug product, that is, I try to get rid of my drug product with this metacresol, which is interfering, and make it like a drug substance, then do the same thing with the innovator, and then run the CD spectrum. And at that place, I also have to show that it does not affect the efficacy of my molecule. So we also have to perform certain in vitro bioassays to show that after extraction, my product is still the same. So that is why some of these methods like CD have certain disadvantages when you finally formulate it into the drug product buffer. So this is a very good case to show that drug product is sometimes not the best sample to run your CD experiments.
I have a question.
Sure.
So, can't we run only metacresol and see the profile is subtracted? Like, in HPLC, you run a placebo or dB buffer before our sample injection?
No. So yeah, good question. So if you look at metacresol, the red one, so typically what we do, so the lower point that I'm showing in the spectra is the high tension voltage. So high tension voltage, whenever the data that you get typically should be always below 700 volts. So if you look at metacresol, just metacresol, red, even at 230 nanometers, the high tension voltage goes up to somewhere 800. So what it means is that whatever data that is being collected from here is not reliable. The signal to noise ratio is not right. So it does not work like your HPLC, where you can actually subtract just the metacresol, because the data that is coming anything below this wavelength is not reliable.
But we can dilute it and so voltage can increase, like, I'm just asking.
Dilute what? The metacresol?
Yeah, like the oral sample.
Yeah. So
What
then
is
you
the
will not get.
kind of-
So you will not get any signal for your protein itself. If you dilute it, so typical concentrations recommended for far UVCD are somewhere around 0.2 mg per ml or 0.1. So anything below whatever signal that you get is of not much use. So like you asked, it's not like an HPLC based method where you can actually subtract your the excipient.
If your concentration still lies within that window what circle is, then you can still dilute
Yeah.
it, but you cannot dilute further.
Further, yeah.
Yes.
We can have a trial like this.
Yeah, you can go. That's what I'm doing. That's what I'm doing. So in the next part, so once you find out what is the ideal buffer for your sample, then you find out which buffer you want to dilute. So here I have diluted it in drug substance formulation buffer and millicube. So what you find that, so here the black, red, so on, you have diluted it further. So you can see that the further you dilute, the signal goes down, right? Because the protein is getting diluted. Then what happens is that you need to find out whether I want to dilute it in DS, drug substance formulation buffer, or millicube. You can see that the black and here red. So the black one is actually the drug substance formulation buffer. So you have better signal there. And ideally you would not want to dilute it in millicube, because you are again diluting your excipients also. You want to try to see that it's the most, closest to your formulation. So that is why here we further go and say that drug substance formulation buffer still gives me good signal at 0.2 mg per ml. So these are parts of method development that you do.
So is the molarity of the buffer will affect on the HTML?
Molarity, sorry.
Molarity means 0.1 phosphate buffer and not 0.01 phosphate buffer.
Yeah.
The buffer concentration, the molarity of that buffer.
It will affect the signal. So that's why I'm saying we do not even want to go to phosphate buffer, because we want to keep it in the drug substance formulation buffer as much as possible. Like I said, we whenever we change the buffers, we need to justify the regulator that this change in buffer does not change your protein or doesn't affect your efficacy. So what here I'm trying to say is that we try to see that we keep it closest to the formulation, but if we don't have a choice, we go to millicube, and then maybe next is your phosphate buffer. And we also always have a look at this HT values. It should not go beyond.
If suppose my protein is a dimer and I want to check the CD spectrum of that monomer, and if I use the reducing agent like DTT,
Yes.
so that DTT will again affect the CD spectrum
Yes.
in measuring.
It will. I'll come to that. Come to that. So it will affect the CD spectrum. And most of the case, for example, that's a good question. So also here you see after 19, so this is 200, 195. 195 your HT values start rising. So what it shows is that beyond this point your signals are not reliable. So you want to cut your CD signal. Typically 700 is the maximum recommended voltage. So we want to cut, so if suppose your CD signal beyond this wavelength is going beyond 700 HD voltage, you would want to stop collecting the spectra here. Of course, you'll lose some data, but you will at least have some data here. You can see that you have one minima coming. So that's where you need to decide when you develop the method, right? So move on to, so these are some of the parameters that you want to change when you're collecting the data. So don't just get overwhelmed when you just see this big table. So easy to understand. What we have done is that first 3 parameters, we want to change only one parameter at one time and try to see of these 3 which one is the best and then move on. So similarly, once you decide on one parameter, finalize it, then you again change one parameter at a time and then see which one is the best. So however, you do not have to follow the same order that here. So if I see data pitch, bandwidth, scan speed, DIT accumulation, so it's not required that you always begin with data pitch. That's again the choice that you always have, whichever you want to change, but always change only one parameter at a time. So this is now I have 3 like parameter 1, 2, 3. I have tried 3 different data pitches: 1 nanometer, 0.5, 0.2. Then you look at the spectra. So if you see the blue one, it's much more smoother than the the other 2 spectra. So which is again 1 nanometer data pitch. So that is why I go ahead, select 1 nanometer data pitch. So then I will change. So out of these 3, I choose 1. So next, you again look at the spectra. Sorry.
Can you go to previous? If you see the left top corner, in the blue one you have a different profile. Left top corner.
Yeah, that's right. So it's different profile in the here.
You can see the flat now. So
Yeah.
what's the reason why?
Reason I cannot really say any.
Because we are opting 1 nanometer selecting, but in that reason we are not getting
So this region,
washing up is not.
this region, for example, like I said, so this is somewhere where the data is not so reliable. So you would want to cut and look at only this region where it's more reliable. So you will not want to look at this particular where.
It's the same sample run at different.
Yeah.
Only one parameter.
So one of the major reasons for this zone not considered is also because of dissolved oxygens. So it is also recommended that you should use liquid nitrogen. Sorry, not
So this is the nitrogen.
nitrogen. So you should purge with
So this-
nitrogen and then run the samples, which we don't do on a routine basis.
It always happens. So typically we have a nitrogen cylinder connected. But the question that you are saying is that so here data is not very reliable and you always see the difference. So what you need to consider is that this region, and later when I finalize my method, I will also finalize the wavelength where I want to start.
Yes.
Start or from where I can have reliable data. Right? So here what the focus is this region.
Smoothing.
Yeah, and typically we do not go to, so there are smoothing, the software itself, you have smoothing parameters, but we do not want to use it most of the times. So then, similarly, bandwidth, so bandwidth, typically it should be less than or equal to 1 nanometer. So we tried now 1 and 0.5, and we see that the 0.5 nanometer one, which is parameter 4, is the blue one is smoother. So we go ahead, select that. So 1 nanometer. So this one, parameter 1 is smoother. So that's how we choose the parameters. So similarly, this is again 2 different scan speeds. So sometimes even when you collect data at slower scan speeds, it may not be so smooth. And also slower scan speeds might increase your analysis time. So here you see that the 20 nanometer is still more smoother than 10, but this again depends on your sample and it may vary. You have to actually do the experiment in order to get to such kind of.
So if there is essentially no significant difference between slower versus faster, you better choose the faster one and you'll save the time.
Save time.
But the range is around scanning speed, like these are the 2, 10 and 20, but what's the range instrument around?
So
Very
instrument can go even till 5,000 nanometer. Yeah.
That much.
So, but I mean, for biologic sample, we do not go like 50 nanometer per minute. So 50 or maximum 100.
It will take 30 seconds to run.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I'm saying CD, if you have the instrument, can give you a global picture within a day or two. And NMR, you need to spend more time. So it depends on what you want and at what stage of the project you are. So early stage, you can always do the CD and see at least if protein is folded or not. And if you can find out issues there, right, you can go to the process guys and say that, my product is this and you need to do something about it. So that is why it's a quick, faster way to, do at the process stage, initial stage. So similarly,
There is a if the protein contain more alpha helices, it will show again 208 and 222.
yes.
Is there any proportion to that 208 and 222? Means if the absorbance is more at 208 and less 222,
So-
the opposite side, it will be effect on helical content.
Like Navratna has already spoken about this. So the numbers that we get are only representative numbers. For example, there are typical range of the ratios. For example, we calculate the ratios at the ellipticity values that we obtain at 222, 208. You take the ratios. Ratio around 0.9 suggests that it's an alpha helical structure. But these are numbers which have been typically observed in a database of proteins, and we can say that it's an alpha helical structure. But then they do not really represent the complete, when, for example, you overlay Humira with versus Herceptin, it will not overlay, but you might get probably the same 0.9 number, right? So that's why what I'm trying to say here is that even during I'll show you some data there. Qualification, when we do qualification, so we calculate the ratios and we try to give this as a range. This is the range that we are supposed to observe for this particular molecule. And whenever you run either the innovator or the biosimilar, and this is a typical observed range. If it falls in the range, we say it's a biosimilar. However, I'll not be able to say that if I compare it with some other man, I'll get the same numbers. Right? So I hope I answered you.
So just to add to this, that's a very relevant point. So I think there is a literature already available which gives you a range when a molecule is, whether it is in a monomeric state versus in a dimeric state versus in an aggregated state. So the ratio between 222 by 208, if it is less than 1.05, the molecule is typically in a monomeric state. But if it goes beyond that, then your molecule is prone towards aggregation. And those numbers are defined in literature. Please check around. I do not have that reference right now. I do not remember, but I remember I have read it. So that ratio definitely exists.
It exists.
So if you please go through the literature, you will find out that what is the typical number, what is expected.
It exists and we also report.
Yes,
We also report. So this is again data integration time. Like I said, we have a useful guideline where the scan rate into time constant should always be lesser than your bandwidth. So what we found that out of the three conditions, so the blue and the red are both of them are smooth. However, DIT for 2 seconds complied with the formula, and it was less than the bandwidth. So that is why you go ahead, choose that particular parameter when we collect our data. So going ahead, again we have number of accumulations. So typically we have we can go 5 accumulations or 3 accumulations. So here we see that 5 accumulations is much more smoother. So it will probably increase your data collection time by maybe 5-10 minutes, but still if it's able to give you smoother data, we'll go for the 5 accumulations. But however, you don't want to extend it that it is too long. So we'll stick to, so typical data collection time for UV-CD for a sample maybe like 5 minutes or less than 10 minutes. Near UV is however takes longer because of, there are certain more issues that you have in near UV. So however, so like here I'm just showing you the final instrument parameters after we did some of this development. So these are the typical parameters for this particular molecule, whichever I show. So here, so going forward, so this is one study or one thing that we always do during development, where, for example, even Navratna was talking about this, that if suppose there is some oxidation, for example, oxidation or reduction, that might be happening in your protein. So we subject the sample to force degradation condition. And what we do here is, for example, I'll show here, this is a forced degradation condition where we subjected the sample to oxidation using hydrogen peroxide. It's a, what should I say, really extreme parameter or extreme condition that you're focusing your protein, like subjecting your protein to, which may not happen during a process. But is your technique really able to detect that? That is where your method capability comes in. So here, if you see, I had subjected my sample to really, forced oxidation, and I see a really perturbed CD profile. It shows that your sample is able to pick up, forced degradation conditions. However, this does not really say, for example, if at a residue level, few of my residues are getting oxidized and that happens, the CD may not be able to pick it up. And there you need to go for higher resolution techniques. However, whenever we develop a method, we at least want to show, is your method able to pick up, maybe major changes in oxidation. So that is why we do forced degradation studies, and typical conditions of forced degradation are oxidation, reduction, just like you said, vortexing. We really see if vortexing making aggregates changes. In this case, did not change anything.
So I have just one question. During the force degradation studies, so I will run a control with
Yes.
my force
Correct,
degraded
correct.
sample.
Of course.
So if I'm studying oxidation, in my control, will I add hydrogen peroxide at time 0 and immediately run the sample?
So when we do this particular kind of force degradation oxidation study, so yeah, you run a 0 time point, then you actually quench your sample. Quench after a particular time, add the quenching reagent. I forgot now what is the quenching. So you quench the sample and then run, again the sample.
So what would quenching add one more
Yeah.
level of stress to the sample again?
No, quench is just you stop the oxidation. So what quenching does? So when you add your oxidation agent, so you're beginning your protein is getting oxidized, and maybe you have a time point of maybe like 1 hour. Subject it, stop the reaction, quench it. That is, you add it, and then you collect your CD spectrum. So similarly, you will collect your 0 time point also, right? And you also what we do is that you also have your buffer with the oxidizing agent, so that you also see if the buffer, when you add your oxidizing agent, that is changing a spectrum.
And just on one, when I will expose my samples to that particular stress,
Yes,
it will be exposed to the formulation buffer.
correct.
And then I have to modify the sample for CD analysis according to
No.
HD.
So I didn't get you.
Like if the protein is in the formulation buffer,
Yeah,
and I particularly know that my formulation interferes with my HD voltage.
right.
So I typically have to dilute it to that particular concentration, or might be I will have to desert it in some other buffer. which is
Agree.
not-
So force degradation usually the conditions are tested only when your final collecting parameters of CD are known. So at that time. So this is typically done at the last.
So when your method is developed and you are ready, you know what is my sample, final sample which I will develop, then
Then only you will add.
No, my question was.
I understood your question. That's fair question. Very good question actually. But you don't. Sorry. That evaluation is usually not done because after forced degradation of your sample, because you exchange it again into a buffer, so you are adding one more condition that may or may not give you the right result. So that is not known. So that is not done also.
Yeah, so like he said, that will give you one more ambiguity factor to decide whether this is happening because of the, the buffer exchange again, right? So typically, force degradation is done when you finalize your buffer condition and then add your. So this overall idea of doing force degradation is to understand if my method is capable of detecting any changes. That's why we do this.
So one question, just to Shankar's point. So if I degrade my sample at a higher temperature, right? And in your SCC method, for control, say you are seeing an HMWP of 0.1%. But after degradation, you see a degradation product or HMWP of 2%. Would you expect a change in CD spectrum? No. Yes? No? Yes? No. Why? Why? If it is no, why? If it is yes, why?
How many people say yes and how many people say no?
Okay, let's get to this. Okay, how many people say it's yes? You should we expect a change in CD spectrum if I see a 2% of HMWP in comparison to 0.1% for a control sample? How many people say no? Okay, so those who said no, please tell me why no.
Because here mostly we are evaluating the secondary structure.
Yes.
So the beta sheet and alpha helix will not change. Even aggregation is a next level of structural change. So we will not able to evaluate that part here. Like a tertiary structure. So
Okay.
so
Okay. Anyone else would like to add on to what you said?
maybe you see minor change in the profile, but
There is
maybe very minor.
Huh?
there should be change because there is again fundamental changes in the protein. If there is
He said
Secondary
information
structure
change. So from 0.5% is going to 2%. So do you think that 1.5% difference is going to show up here?
The aggregation is more about molecules coming together. So there is no change in the secondary structure as such during aggregation.
Actually, this is not the real reason. Is because 2% difference CD kind of technique doesn't be there. So you will not be able to even detect those changes. You will notice it when there is a massive change. What is shown in the
That's what it's
degradation
like. It's
profile.
a massive.
Otherwise, CD is low resolution. In fact, NMR also wouldn't be able to tell you. Yes, if you need 5 to 10% of your degraded product, and then you start seeing a next population of species apart from the main population. That happens. Actually, 1 to 2% typically you start seeing in NMR because sensitivity, as I showed you today, is very poor with NMR. Fine. So again, 2-3% you will not be able to identify. Typically, this is same with bioassays as well. So bioassay has a huge variability. 80 to 120%, 2-3% doesn't make a difference.
So that is why what I think Navrat is also trying to say here is that you need to choose the right method. If you want to look at aggregates for looking at that 1.5% change, you probably need to choose AUC or something which is a method to look at aggregates
Or SCC.
or ACC. And so this is a method for secondary structure estimation, and I'm sure that 1.5% difference will not be able to see this. So this change means that probably 50% of your molecule is oxidized. That is why you see that huge difference in spectrum. So going forward, so when you do qualification for the CD method, so you run specificity So what you do is just to see if there is any matrix interference. So you don't see matrix interference and you're able to get a typical profile of your sample. So in a matter of time, I'll just quickly run through a few of these slides. So what I want to say here is that in method qualification for a characterization method, you typically do specificity and intermediate precision. So what intermediate precision means is that you have this kind of matrix. So repeatability set A. You do 6 preparations of your sample, collect it on day 1. Then set B is you collect it on day 2. Then set C is you change the analyst. So overall, so repeatability gives you for 6 preparations, and then intermediate precision gives you between inter-day and inter-analyst. So that's what you calculate your percent RSD.
This intermediate precision, it's inter-analyst and also inter-instrument, or you have to?
Good question. So inter-instrument is typically not recommended or typically not done for characterization methods.
You won't have two CDs.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. That's why I didn't put it here. Having one CD instrument at a place is maybe a luxury. so that is why I've not put inter-instrument. For HPLCs, definitely you do it. But for characterization methods, you do not do it.
And I just had one more question. When we qualify a characterization method, we will typically use it for a batch release test, or when is the time?
So batch release tests are mostly not characterization methods. So this is mostly like a biosimilarity. So you do it when your final product is there, and you do not use it for release.
Yeah, because this is the first time I am looking at qualifying characterization.
That's what I'm saying. So these are the recommended. So there are no guidelines. So for release methods, you have a complete ICH guideline for validation and qualification. Characterization methods, there is no guideline, but at least the regulators need that you have done specificity, which shows that your method is able to pick up the signal from your sample, and method variation. They want to see when you run your sample, how much method variation is observed when you collect sample.
It's just to show the authenticity of your.
Yes. Yeah. Correct. Right. So here.
The qualitative methods actually.
Yeah.
That's qualitative. That gives you some information, understanding of the product. That's sufficient.
And also, so we calculate the percent RSD, the difference between 6 preparations. Then I go forward for my inter-day and inter-analyst precision. So, for example, there was a question here: do you actually calculate the ratio between the 2 minima observed? Yes, we calculate the ratio, and we see that the variation is 0.45 plus or minus 0.01. So you calculate inter-day precision, and so this is typically just to show that your method is tight between these 2 numbers, and you see that the method variation is less than 1% for the wavelength minima that is being collected for repeatability and intermediate precision. So that's what. So we also do robustness. Robustness is not actually required, but we sometimes just want to do it just to show if our sample is stable for a particular period of time after storage at room temperature or 2 to 8 degrees. So we also do that, and here I show that even after storage up to 6 hours at room temperature and 24 hours does not affect the spectrum. So this is again a case study which I guess Navratna has already shown. So here we have just collected CD spectra for innovator and a biosimilar molecule, and we see that a typical profile with a minima. However, you see that there is quite some variation. But if your sample is between the innovator and the if it is between, then you are okay. So here I move a little quickly. So what I'm trying to show here is that from the spectra you can calculate the percentage beta sheet. So here the average is 73.5 for the beta sheet structure estimation. Similarly, for our biosimilar sample, we're able to get numbers. So, like he said, these numbers are not exactly the representation of the molecule. CD is more of a qualitative method. And what we want to show is that the spectra overlay with each other, and then you match the minimas. So that is what we try to give the regulators also. So here, this is one approved application of Mylan, I guess. This came from the BLA. So what they have submitted is that Herceptin, the beta sheet estimation is within this range. And you want to show that, so you have two Herceptins with one which is sourced from US and the EU market. And you can see that they have the SD values plus and minus SD values, and all the biosimilar molecules, the percentage beta sheet is fitting into these. So based on this, we can claim biosimilarity of secondary structure. Similarly, this is again a qualitative data where we are saying that the biosimilar, the red one, spectra of biosimilar overlay with the spectra of the innovator with comparable minimum and comparable beta sheets estimates. So that is what they typically we claim with CD. So then we also use these methods when we want to show process comparability. So this, like if there is a process change, sometimes they pick up. So here you can see that refolding time of the process was changed to improve yield. So pre-process change samples, the DS samples, we collected CD spectra, post-process change. There is no change here, and we are saying that the processes are comparable. However, we do not really go to NMR or anything at this point, saying that as long as you are able to demonstrate efficacy of the molecule, we really do not have to say that after the process change, something has. So here we do not see any change. So we can say that the new process is still good. So these are some of the, what should I say, advantage of using CD, far UV CD, for both biosimilarity, process comparability, and also throughout the life cycle of the molecule. So just to summarize, I showed you matrix interference, what all optimization of sample concentration and diluent, then instrument parameters that will be changing during data collection, post degradation, and some of the few aspects of what we do during method qualification. So same process is also done. So this same process is also done for near UVCD. So then we finalize our parameters, whatever we use. Then so this is how a typical biosimilarity exercise that you do. So this is actually intermediate precision. But what you can see is that this is how the near UV spectra looks like. So here you have your tryptophan signal, then tyrosines here, and phenylalanine. So here there is good overlay between 6 preparations. So then when I go for, I'll go to the biosimilarity. So here, so this is some of the data that we were able to generate for near UVCD. So near UVCD is slightly tricky in the sense you need to have higher sample concentrations, and also the volume that you typically use for near UVCD is higher. So with the pathway, because of the, like he mentioned, you have very few aromatic side chains. So that is why the requirement of near UVCD, however, they are more information rich compared to far UVCD, because they give a tertiary structure estimation. So, and here you can typically see that they overlay very well. So we can say, like globally, the tertiary structure is similar between the, so these are the innovators, RMP, and then that's the biosimilar molecule. So going forward, so this is again what we do when we sometimes submit data. So the average between the biosimilar and the originator molecule, we give the average, say they are comparable, and say they are qualitatively similar. So going forward, this is again, taken from a BLA application which is approved. So you can see that the profiles of the biosimilar lot and the US lot, they overlay very well with each other, showing that they are of similar textures. So going forward, I'll move on to secondary structure estimation, which is probably the last leg here. So like Navratna already mentioned, so what we do when we do secondary structure estimation is that, so typically JASCO has an inbuilt software which will give you the numbers, or else there are online tools available. I would recommend DICROWeb, and there is a new version of a secondary structure estimation software which I was not aware of, but it is when I explored it, I found out it's really interesting. But I would recommend you to try using DICROWeb. It's mostly available for academic users. I was not able to use it because industry needs a separate license. However, if you have a JASCO machine, it has an inbuilt software which you can use. What secondary structure estimation does is that you have the CD spectrum of your protein, which is the sum total of the fraction of your alpha helix, fraction of your beta sheet, fraction of your terms, and fraction of your random point. So what you're trying to estimate, so you have this number in your hand. What you need to estimate is this fraction. How much fraction of alpha helix or beta sheet or turn is present in my sample or in my protein, which I can get from my overall CD spectrum. So the software calculates these numbers from your overall CD spectra and gives you a root mean square deviation of how good your fit is. That is what all these softwares do. And for doing this, so most of these softwares have a reference of standards which they use, which have been characterized by X-ray crystallography, which help them to find out how a typical profile or a CD spectrum of a protein of complete alpha helix or will be. And that is where this number comes. Like for example, this A comes from there. So all these softwares have a database of reference spectra which they use to calculate the percentages. So this is just to show you a fitting which comes with the JASCO inbuilt software. So Avastin is a biosimilar molecule, and what you can see is that the numbers that, so it is a beta sheet, so it's a map. So you can see that the numbers that we have are the same. So this is a biosimilar. So you can see that the numbers of beta sheet 73.4. So this is what you report when you file or when you BLA application. You can report these numbers, but it's not essential that it will always be the same. So what you need to do is you may have to run multiple lots of your biosimilar, and typically you run your innovator sample and see what is the range that you're getting in, and then see if your sample also falls in that range. So these numbers are the numbers that I showed you in the previous slide here. Yeah. So these are the numbers. So you calculate the beta sheet percentage of your sample and see of multiple lots and see where they fall. So these are the numbers which are shown in this figure. So these can be calculated if you have the JASCO inbuilt software, which is typically useful, and most people who collect data use that software. However, I will also want to just go through this online software which I found. So it's called as BEST-CEL. So it stands for Beta Structure Selection. So you can probably go ahead and refer these references. So, but what this does is that what are the advantages that this software provides over the existing software. So the main advantage that they claim is that they can typically predict 8 secondary structure elements. I'll come to that. What are these 8 secondary structure elements? And over the existing methods, they claim that they are highly accurate because they cover a broader range of proteins, including beta structure rich proteins, which are the typical maps. And I'll go over how you will be able to fit the data on this. So these are the 8 secondary structure elements which they claim are the output of this software gives. So one is helix, which is covering the middle part of the alpha helix. Then you have two residues at the end of the alpha. These are distorted alpha helix. Then there's also left twisted beta strands. So beta strands, typically when the JASCO software gives you only beta sheet percentage. So this software can actually distinguish between parallel and anti-parallel beta sheet. So that's what they say. Anti 1, 2, 3. Then you have a parallel beta set. Then you have your term. And others claim for 310 helix and pi helix and so on. So these are some of the advantage or some of the secondary structure elements which this particular software can bring. So I will recommend you people, if you have some data, I can show you some data which has already been fit using this software to show the output of what this software can generate. So
how to give an input on this software? Like this online you said.
Online you need to put some CD data.
It takes the software raw data files or
Raw data file you need to convert it into Notepad and then put it in the software. You have to collect it in a particular range which they recommend. I'll show you. So just to summarize my talk, so I went over a few steps that are involved in the development and qualification of far and near UV-CD and how this method can be used for biosimilarity, and just touched upon few points on secondary structure estimation. So I think that's my last slide. And, thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, you can always contact me. That's my mail ID. Thank you very much. I'll just show the results. So I'll just continue. Just to show you how this software can be used for secondary structure estimation. So typically what you do is you choose your file. So what I will do is I have some raw data, so I will just show you. So you upload this file, then you input your units here. So it can be ellipticity. So typically you need to provide them a concentration. So this sample was collected at 3.95 micromolar, and you need to give them the number of residues which a protein is, then the path length, typically it's 0.1 centimeter for far UV-CD. So it's an online software, and you can go and use it. So after this, you just say submit. So then it asks you to confirm whether this is how your spectra looks, and then you just say calculate the secondary structure. beyond 190 nanometers, it's typically not so great. So you can see a lot of, so this is the experimental data that you gave, and then your fitting is not so great. So what you want to do is you want to cut your wavelength range. So from 200 to 250, and then just say recalculate. So now you see it's a much better fit, right? That you can also see from your RMSE value, right? So what you also want to see here, so this is the result that it gave. So secondary structure estimation percentage, 75.4 for your helix, and here again it gives you the split, helix 1 and helix 2, regular and distorted. Also have your parallel turn and others. So this is an approved molecule. So this is the data that I put in is for filgrastim. So filgrastim, you have the crystal structure available. And if you look at the structure of filgrastim, it's a 4 helix bundle. So it's known that it's an alpha helix. So what we can say is that the spectra that you have generated is a true representation of the actual crystal structure. You can at least claim that. So that is what I'm trying to show you from this fitting is that you can use the raw data that you're generating from your CD and try to estimate the overall secondary structure using this software. If you don't have access to a CD instrument or anything, so I guess I'm not sure how you will access the raw data also. Maybe if Aditya is able to.
Actually, I don't have the entire.
Yeah, so what he had is probably did not have the complete range of data. So this software needs the data from 190 to 250. If you cut it out, it's not able to calculate, the secondary structure. However, just I gave you a demonstration of how this software can be used to estimate secondary structure. So, just any questions?
Already tired.
Okay, thank you very much.
No, you wanted to ask, please ask. Please ask.
Yeah, sure.
Others will actually.
No, actually, I have a very basic question since I don't know anything about structural. As you said, this is characteristic of alpha helix, right?
Yes, this is yeah.
So what is the exact representation of the characteristic? I don't know exactly.
Yeah, so typical alpha helix will have two minima, one around 208 nanometers and around 222 nanometers. So if you have a characteristic minima at these two wavelengths, you can say that predominantly my protein has an alpha helix. So that's how much you can claim. And here you can see in this that it has minima around 222 nanometer and again 208. So you can say that it's a predominantly alpha helix.
So if we are getting two minima within this region,
Yes.
can say
Yes, yes. It's a characteristic. So like some of the data for maps, you will just have one minima around 217 nanometers, which indicates beta sheet structure. So it's a global method to say what is the rough secondary structure of your protein. That's the maybe take home message. So,
One small addition I did. So, you remember I was talking in the first slide saying that your protein is actually it has all amino acids are chiral in nature. So that chirality, because that's an asymmetric amino acid, when this circularly polarized light passes through it, it absorbs left versus right in a distinctive manner. Now, because you have a continuous stretch of your alpha helical elements, they all generate the summation of your result into this kind of typical profile. That is why you see a minima at certain wavelengths, is what is reflected here.
it's an addition of the whole.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
You can
calculate the melting
Hey, you will get killed by others now. Please ask, please ask.
Can you calculate the melting temperature using CD?
Yes, you can. So I showed you the 20 and then I showed you the CD setup, right? I had a 28 device. So in that what we do is we heat the protein from the range of like maybe 10 degrees. I don't want to go below 10 degrees. We go all the way up to 90 degrees. You know? So what happens is that, and then we look at the electricity at a particular wavelength. For example, if it's an alpha helical structure, I would want to look at 220 to 208 and just see what is the change in my electricity over this temperature range. So if it's a well-folded protein, you will get a transition temperature. And this transition temperature, many times it matches with your DSC data. That is differential scanning calorimetry. And differential scanning calorimetry, you get a profile like this. You have a TM, which is the melting point. TMs using CD match. It's an orthogonal. DLS, I'm not very sure. DLS, no. DSC and CD, yeah.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Srinivas.